In today's video, I wanted to do a super quick walkthrough on jargon that we as property managers use every day, but property investors that we speak to don't really know what we're talking about. So it shouldn't be super quick. I'm going to run through a few different terminologies that I use on a regular day-to-day basis. I prefer to avoid using jargon when talking to clients, but I find especially when property investors are in the game for a long period of time, it helps to know and have a basic understanding of the legislation and the jargon that property managers use. The first one I wanted to walk through today is the Form 6. You may have heard an agent when you were signing up with them say, right, we'll get the Form 6 sorted. It essentially is the contract that you are agreeing to let the agency work on your behalf. So this is what you will receive and have to fill out and sign when you are signing up a new agent to manage one of your properties. The next one is a fixed term tenancy or a fixed term lease. 9 times out of 10, we want to avoid periodic leases. The reason why is because we as the agency or you as the landlord have less control if it's a periodic tenancy. What a periodic tenancy means is that there is no end date. What a fixed term tenancy means is that there is an end date. After a period where the first lease is about to finish, that you can decide on how a tenancy will continue. You can extend the fixed term agreement by agreeing on a new end date, or enter into a new fixed term agreement, or do nothing and allow the agreement to convert to a periodic agreement. The thing to remember is that if the tenant does not sign a new lease and their lease has ended, it automatically goes to a periodic lease agreement. We want to avoid that all the time. The first option to extend the existing fixed term agreement is not my preference. There may have been some legislation changes, or we may want to increase the rent as well. And if we're just simply extending the lease agreement, that will not be suitable to implement a rent increase or any new conditions that we want. The next one is to enter into a new agreement. This is the preference. This is what a tenant will sign, a Form 18A, or also known as a general tenancy agreement. The third option is to do nothing so the agreement becomes periodic. That again simply means that there is now no end date. The best option, I believe, for property investors is to have a fixed term agreement with all tenants at all times. That is what a fixed term agreement is. The next one we're going to look at is a notice to leave. This is what we as the agent gives the tenant. This is also known as a Form 12. The notice that the tenant gives to the agent to leave is a different notice. It's called a Form 13. The thing to remember is if we're giving a notice to leave to a tenant, we have to give at least 2 months notice. I prefer to give more because it allows a new tenant to find a new place. And we cannot simply hit them with a notice to leave, asking them to vacate 2 months before their lease end date. It has to be preferably for them to vacate on the end of their current lease agreement. That means if their lease ends on, let's say, the 16th of July, we want to issue a notice to leave in early May, requiring them to vacate on the 16th of July 2026. That is the best way to move a tenant on, or say, for example, you're wanting the property vacant so you can sell it. You want to make sure that you align that perfectly, because if you do it before the notice to leave is invalid, if you send the notice with 59 days, the notice to leave is invalid. You can send a notice to leave with, for example, say they are vacating the end of July, but it can mess up with the lease renewal and the rent increase timeline. What I mean by that is we want to make sure whenever a lease agreement ends, we can increase the rent, because we can only increase the rent once every 12 months. However, on the other hand, a Form 13, which let me simply pull up here, this is a form that the tenant can give to the owner saying they want to vacate. The thing that a tenant gets away with is they don't have to give 2 months notice. The minimum notice they have to give is only 2 weeks. That means it forces the property manager and the landlord to scramble to get a new tenant. Whereas if we know that the property will be vacant in 2 months, we can advertise it to our waiting list off market and then advertise the property earlier so we have a large amount of quality applicants to pick from. When a tenant breaks lease, that is not the case. To continue on that, for fixed term tenancy agreements entered into or after the 30th of September 2024, which would most likely be the lease agreement between your agency and the tenant that's renting your property, they only have to pay a maximum amount of rent or rent until a new tenant moves in, whichever is the lesser cost. And that's it. Which means letting fees, you have to pay. Advertising fees, you have to pay. And if the tenant is breaking lease, let's say a month before their actual lease end date, they only have to pay a week's rent at maximum. That means you have to pay for the letting fee from the agency, the advertising fee, and probably some vacancy period if we go down to the reletting cost calculator. Let's say the tenant's lease started on the 16th of July 2025. Let's say their lease ends on the 16th of July 2026. Right now, we are the 28th of June at the time of recording this video. Let's backtrack 2 weeks. Let's say on the 12th, I got approved to live in another rental because I needed to upgrade my rental. I had a family and I needed more space. I gave my notice on the 12th, meaning that I was vacating on the 26th of June. That means I'm handing over vacant possession on the 26th of June. That is technically my vacate date. I only have to pay 1 week's rent, which means I only have to pay up until the 3rd of July. Get a bond clean done, get a carpet clean done, dust my hands, and move on. Whereas 2 weeks ago, that agency, if we received that mid-afternoon or late afternoon on Friday, it may not be actioned until Monday. After that, the property has to be advertised and you have to show prospective tenants through while people are packing, which also may not be the most beneficial time to show people through when there's stuff everywhere of the previous tenants. It makes it extremely difficult to lease properties quickly and get a win for the investor, which is our client. Enough from me. That's something to consider, and many investors still aren't fully aware of this change of legislation, and it's something to consider when budgeting each year for your properties. The next one I wanted to speak on is routine inspections. This inspection can only be conducted once every 3 months, or it works out to be once every 17 weeks. We have to give at least 7 days notice. That's not an issue because we plan months and months ahead. Of course, we only send the notice maybe 14 to 30 days out because we don't want tenants knowing the exact time we're going to be at the property for every single time during the year, because sometimes we find things that we aren't supposed to find, and that's part of our job, to make sure the tenant is keeping the property in good condition. Additionally, if you are the landlord doing an inspection at one of your tenanted properties, or you're accompanying the agency at the property, you can only attend within a 2-hour period. That's a blanket rule. If you're an owner or agency, you can only ever be at the property for a maximum of 2 hours. I personally try and do what I need to do, then get out as quick as possible because it is somebody's home. While yes, we do manage the property, while yes, it's not the tenant's property, I still like to respect their home. Routine inspections are to ensure the property is well cared for by the tenant and to check if there are any repair, maintenance, or health and safety issues. I have had tenants wait until a routine inspection to discuss maintenance. What we train tenants on, especially the way that we like to manage, is let us know as soon as possible, because if it's a leaking tap, we want to know as soon as possible and not wait 3 months later until we do the next routine inspection for us to know that there's a massive leak at the property and there's water damage around the entire property. This is something that is controversial. Up here it says the property is to be well cared for by the tenant, but it is also not a housework inspection, which means if the tenant has clothes or laundry on the floor, that's not an issue. But if the property isn't clean, it will damage the appeal of the property in the future, which means that tenant does have an obligation to clean that. But if they have laundry or a few clothes lying around, I'm not worried. And we can't enforce it under legislation anyway. After that is the entry condition report. We in Property Manager speak use ECR, or you may have heard our property manager say ingoing report. The simplest way I explain this to new people we train and property investors is we document every single thing at that property in 2 forms: photos and written. The truth is, the only reason an entry condition report exists is to make sure that we can hold the tenant accountable at the end of the tenancy. If the tenant said, oh, that damage to the door was damaged on entry, but if we did our job right, we can simply pull up a photo and the writing and say, first, the written note say there was no damage and you agreed to that and signed it. Secondly, here's a photo of the exact same door a year ago and it's not damaged. It makes exits a lot easier and makes sure we can hold tenants accountable for things that they have done at the property. Most tenants, and I'm talking probably 98% of tenants, we never have an issue. But for those 2% of tenants, we want to make sure that they are held accountable. Going off from that is the exit condition report. This is what is completed when the tenant vacates. I have not seen tenants return a filled out exit condition report because sometimes their version of clean is different to our version of clean. What I have found very helpful is meet the tenant at the property and go through the report with them. That means we can finalize the bond sooner, we can move a tenant in sooner because there are no issues waiting to be resolved and the property does not have to be vacant for an extended period of time. That there is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 jargon terms explained. Now, all of this information comes from the RTA, which is the Residential Tenancies Authority. If you do have any questions about a tenancy or about the legislation, they are really helpful. So I would highly recommend, if you do have any questions, give them a call. They may be busy, but give them a call. Speak to a real person that knows legislation, and then you can fact check yourself, you can fact check a property manager you're concerned about. I find it really helpful. Sometimes I may even give them a call just to double check that I am doing the exact right thing.